Hello, and welcome to the Mind Report. I'm Tamar Gendler.
And I'm Mahzarin Banaji.
So it's my pleasure today to be having a conversation with Mahzarin Banaji, who is a professor at Harvard University, well known for her work on implicit attitudes in general and implicit bias in particular, and author of the recently released book, The Blindspot, Hidden Biases of Good People. And I was hoping, Mahzarin, that we could, in the course of this conversation, situate the particular work you've done on implicit bias and the particularly innovative measures that you've developed for identifying implicit bias within a broader context of understanding human psychology. So I wondered whether you'd be willing to start with a few words about the ways in which explicit attitudes and implicit attitudes in general can come apart in people and what that tells us about the structure of the human mind and the guidance of human behavior.
Sure, Tamar. The way to think about this work is to really situate it in the past 100 years of work in experimental psychology, broadly speaking. So for about 100 years, psychologists have largely used one measure to study adult cognition. We ask people. So let's just use a very simple example of how we study human memory. Until the late 1970s and maybe even really into the 1980s, we studied memory by asking people for conscious recollection. We would say, learn this list of words and we'll give you a test later for the list of words you just learned, requiring people to reflect back on a previous moment and to report introspectively on what it is that they remembered seeing then. Tell me what you ate for breakfast yesterday in the morning. Those are the kinds of questions on which we relied in trying to understand human memory. And then in the late 1970s and early 80s, I would say a small revolution occurred in the field of memory, where people began to ask questions about other ways of getting to our memories. This work came, by and large, from beautiful experiments that were done to show that ordinary people who have no recollection for certain events that have occurred to them do indeed show some savings in memory for having encountered it. They might be faster to respond to it. They might feel the information appeared before them for longer periods of time, even when it didn't, because they had some kind of a trace there that they were retrieving. And so that kind of work began to lead psychologists to ask the question, are these all forms of memory? And in the memory area, certainly people responded by saying, yes, it's all memory, but there are two different kinds of it. There's conscious recollection, and then there is this implicit form of memory, an unconscious, less conscious form of memory. So all we've done, I think, is to take that idea and move it along to ask the question, is it possible that certain kinds of social beliefs that we have, is it possible that certain kinds of preferences that we have, our attitudes, also reside in these two different forms, so that when you ask me, how do you feel about this group of people? How do you feel about Arabs, for example? How do you feel about Asians? That I might tell you something quite honestly about my beliefs about those groups of people, how worthy they are, my criticisms of them as a group, whatever it might be. But then that's just one form of the attitude. We're very interested in other forms of the same attitude that might lie below the surface, of which we may be much less aware, in the same way as an amnesic patient who may have memories for things that have happened simply isn't able to reach in and just pull them out through the brute force of introspection.
And of course, this discovery that you're identifying in the 1970s and 1980s in cognitive psychology was part of the world picture of the human mind for millennia. The ancient Greek tradition speaks of us being made up of a charioteer and two horses, where you might think the charioteer has access to our explicit commitments, but there are lots of other tensions that parts of our soul, metaphorically speaking, that pull in other directions. And every world tradition has the picture that the head may say one thing while the heart says another. And of course, the Freudian picture, according to which there's a conscious level that's actually relatively small, and then a huge unconscious level beneath that, picks up on millennia of traditions. So in some sense, it's not surprising to be able to reintroduce into the psychological conversation something of which people had been perhaps implicitly aware throughout the 20th century, but that had somehow fallen out of the research program as the result of methodological limitations.
Yeah, I would say that that's exactly right. The idea has been with us forever, and it predates Freud, for example, in psychology, in the work of Helmholtz,
Yes.
who very, very clearly understood the concept of unconscious inference. And so it's been there. What is different, and I think you nailed it, is technology. Whether it's a magnet with which you can image the brain, or a simple experiment in which you can test how fast you respond to two things when they're paired together. These are new ways in which we're going to be getting access to that which was not previously accessible.
So one of the most exciting things about the work that you've done, in addition to the innovation in content, is really the innovation in methodology. And for listeners of the Mind Report who have not yet had a chance to take the test style that Mahzarin Banaji was instrumental in developing, the implicit associations task, I encourage you to go and try that. And I wonder, Mahzarin, whether you can tempt our listeners into doing so by saying a little bit about what question the IAT allows you to answer and how it goes about doing that.
So the IAT, the implicit association test, was really invented by my co-author on the book, Tony Greenwald, in the mid-1990s. And he was, unlike the rest of us, I think he was interested in thinking about stronger experimental effects that could be created. So yes, there were many other tools available. We were all happily using them to do our work. But Tony was frustrated with the magnitudes of the effects that were being obtained using existing methods.
Can you give us a sense of what some of those existing methods were?
Yeah, so there are wonderful existing methods. You know, you could use something like a Stroop task. So let's say, you know, we can try to get people to get a measure of unconscious cognition. You can do something as simple as have people read the word yellow, but printed in red, and tell them to ignore the word yellow.
So like those charts in doctors' offices that people often see those. Yeah, the posters or T-shirts.
Yes, and what does that do? What it does is it says that the word yellow is so dominant that it intrudes into my awareness and takes my attention to it, when in fact, I'm trying to pay attention to the color in which the word is printed. Mm-hmm. So that's one very, very simple but very powerful example of the kinds of methods that can be used. Others are methods that have been called sequential priming. So if the word king appears on a computer screen, followed by the word queen, you'll be a lot faster at saying that queen is a word than if the preceding word had been semantically unrelated. So if the word bread had appeared and then the word queen, you'll be slower at saying that queen is a word than if it was preceded by king. Suggesting, again, that there is an automatic way in which those have come to be associated, and that speed in milliseconds can give us some measure of the strength of association between, let's say, king and queen, those two items, versus two unrelated things like bread and queen, let's say. So those methods had been around, they had been used. I still think of them as absolutely part of the armament of what experimental psychologists use when they want to get at these automatic aspects of the mind. What the IAT does is something quite similar, and I'll give you an example of how it actually works for those who may not have tried it. Although it can be tried, you can go to a website. It's called implicit.harvard.edu, and you can take one of many different tests that sit there. So our focus was on social groups, although it need not be. I'll say a little bit, if we have time, about the many different uses of the IAT. But let's just start with the most simple example. Nobody would be shocked if I said that if I gave you a bunch of playing cards and asked you to sort them, putting the red cards to the right and the left cards and the black cards to the left, and if I timed you, it turns out, and I've timed myself, it takes about 20 seconds to get through a deck of cards. Now, imagine if I change this task a little bit, and I say, okay, diamonds and clubs to one side, and hearts and spades on the other. You'll be able to do this, but you will do this a lot more slowly. Mm-hmm. And the only reason it's slower is because something's getting in the way. Color, which is a dominant way of separating these, is no longer the cue. Things that have gone together in the past have a way of becoming associated with each other. And all the IAT does is tries to measure how strong those associations are. So now imagine the deck of playing cards, and I changed them. I changed them so that each card either has the face of somebody who's black or white, so features on a face that are largely Eurocentric features or Afrocentric features. And then the other thing I do is I vary cards that have words on them that mean good and bad things in our experience. Words like love and peace and joy, these are good things. Let's take some examples of things that are not so good. Devil, bomb, vomit, these are terrible things. And if I try to sort these cards so that for half the run, I have to place white faces with good things to the right, and anything that's a bad word and black faces to the left. It turns out that for most people, myself included, that's a relatively easy sorting to do. But when I switch, when I consciously try hard to sort white with bad and black with good, my mind appears to slow down. And it slows down because that's not an association that my culture and my life experiences have allowed me to make in the same way as the first one. So that's at the heart of the IAT, measuring the strength of those associations.
So the idea is that if one lives in a society structured by racial stratification in the way that many Americans do, one will come to find it natural to associate certain racial categories with certain terms in the same way that we find it natural to associate diamonds with hearts and spades with clubs in the case of cards, that it's the result of, in some ways, a tacit encoding of frequencies. And it sounds like what happens is that when we've encoded those sorts of things, they are salient to us when we're engaged in sorting tasks, regardless of whether we're trying to sort along a different characteristic. So if I'm explicitly trying to sort, as you said, diamonds and clubs to one side, hearts and spades to another, there'll be this interference effect akin to what you were describing in the case of the Stroop task. Can you say a bit about how that plays out in particular in the case of a gap between these implicit associations that many of us have encoded as the result of living in a society structured by race and explicit egalitarian attitudes that one might have as a commitment for how it is that we actually want to do our sorting and behaving?
So if you look at the data on explicit attitudes, just let's take racial attitudes since we're talking about that group. If you look at the data from the 1930s to now, and interestingly, social psychologists have gone roughly to the same regions of the country every 15 or 20 years and asked largely similar questions to people about their attitudes towards racial groups, their stereotypes of racial groups, and so on. And what you find is that there is massive shift, massive differences. I mean, our predecessors, not that long ago, at the same schools that you and I sit at, would have been quite happy to express fairly negative stereotypes about like many groups of people. And it turns out that these days we cannot get our students to utter one negative stereotype. In fact, if you try to get them to say what it is, they'll look at you like, you better not say this because somebody's going to come and lock you up if you do. That's how much we've changed when it comes to our conscious sense of how we ought to be when we think about groups of people. So this is where the IAT comes in, because I, a self-professed egalitarian, can take the test. And indeed, if some of these associations that I worry about have become cleansed in the same way as my conscious mind is, then I ought to be able to associate the category female, words like Mary and Susan, to the concept professor, just as quickly as I can associate John and Peter to the concept of professor. But it turns out that that doesn't happen, even in me, who knows better and who believes in her mind and in her heart that it's important to be able to make these associations as rapidly for the one group as the other, and who wishes to do that. So that experience, that disparity between where I would like to be and where I end up is interesting. And I often say that on this test, there is nothing like a failing or passing grade on the test. The test really should be judged by your conscious standards. If I show a preference for the Red Sox over the Yankees, and I do that both on the IAT and consciously, there is nothing really for me to do about that. That situation, I would say, does not represent a disparity in need of change. But my gender stereotypes, my assessment that somehow men are more likely to be leaders, or that they somehow are, in my mind, more emblematic of people who make important contributions, to the extent that that's there, and I don't intend to have them, that's where the interesting psychological and certainly, I think, social questions arise.
So I wonder if you could say a bit about what the consequences are of having disavowed implicit attitudes, because there's certainly a picture of human behavior according to which, sure, there's all sorts of noise going on underneath, but our intentional actions on this picture are guided by our explicit beliefs, our reflective desires, and so our actions are guided by those. And it may well be that there's some noisy voices in the background that we have to tell to be quiet, but that we would be able to act as we wished if our explicit commitments were as we wanted them to be. Could you say a bit about how the research that you've participated in and read about suggests that that may not actually describe how it is that we behave in the world?
Look, many of our actions are driven by our conscious choices, right? Just look at this last election, right? Who would have thought, the last two elections, who would have thought that large groups of people in this country would have voted for a black man as president? And it happened. It happened because of the power of that conscious choice. If we looked at people's IAT scores, that would not predict the outcome that we saw. So the IAT is not useful as a predictor in the many cases when our conscious attitudes, even the ones that are different from what the implicit attitude might be, end up having impact. But think about the election. You know, for 2 years before the election, before the 2008 election, we debated this issue. The whole world became engaged in it. We had a chance to ask ourselves, to what extent is my feeling for this candidate or that a function of their age, of their gender, of their race, and so on. We had public debates. We probably each had a private debate. And then at the end of that, we had to walk into a booth and very explicitly mark a little box. I think when everything lines up like that, there is no reason to think that our conscious attitudes will not have impact on our behavior. But let's think also about many other moments in life where the decisions we make are simply not brought into conscious awareness with the same vigor as that election and voting behavior indicates. Think about the number of times a police officer has to make a quick decision, or even a judge who has much more time, but does not recognize that her own social group might influence her in thinking about the degree to which a defendant really, is worth 5 million or 50,000 or 5,000, to the extent that she's not aware that, certain parts of her prefrontal cortex are engaging neurons that are different when she thinks about a similar other versus a different other. Why should this judge know this? This is absolutely new kinds of evidence. This is new stuff that we're all learning about. And so I want to argue that in many, so you and I are teachers, who we call on in a classroom, how we might judge a paper. These are all possible instances in which our beliefs about groups of people can enter into our assessments of them. And I have been surprised to see that even with much of the conscious awareness that I now bring to bear on this, that when I actually collect data on my behavior, the data aren't very pretty. Okay? I even had a graduate student once sit in the back to simply count the number of times I called on women and men in my classroom, knowing that it would be equal. And it wasn't. And that was important for me to know. And I think the IAT ends up predicting some of those kinds of behaviors.
So the idea is that there's certain sorts of behavior that we engage in real-time situations, in situations where our primary energy, cognitive energy, is devoted elsewhere. When you're lecturing, you're thinking about, how am I going to present this information? Is my writing clear on the blackboard? Is my voice audible? And so your energy is devoted to that. And so it sounds like as if I were trying to do a Stroop task while I was distracted and doing something else, and I would fall back into these natural habits of association, even if they're habits that I reflectively disavow, in the same way that, it's harder for me to maintain my commitments about not eating unhealthy food when I'm tired, when I'm in a stressful situation. Anything that's habitual kicks back in, even if under optimal circumstances it can be controlled. So do you think that the literature on self-regulation in general, so things like the famous marshmallow study of Walter Mischel, where you give a child a choice between one marshmallow now or two marshmallows in a short period of time, you might think their explicit commitment would be towards getting the two marshmallows later, but there's a sort of pull towards the desirability of the single marshmallow or any other sort of self-regulation task. Do you see those as being structurally similar to the explicit, implicit regulation that you're talking about in the case of racial bias, or do you think those are distinct families?
I think there is very much a component of that. So I do believe that as the cognitive resources that we have available to us are depleted, that this sort of reliance will only increase. And so we should see evidence of that. And I'm not on top of it because there have been hundreds of studies now published using the IAT, but I'm pretty sure that there are some studies that actually do demonstrate exactly what you're talking about. But I want to go a step beyond and say it's not just in those situations. So let's take the following example. There is a study that was done by a student of mine who used to be at Yale and has been a professor at the University of Colorado for many years, Irene Blair. Irene looked at data on certain prison records and looked to see if for the same crime, black and white inmates had received the same punishment. And what she found was that indeed judges are pretty good. For the same level of crime, black and white inmates received exactly the same sentence, no bias whatsoever. But what Irene did was went a step further. She looked at each face and she came up with a score, or got people to judge these faces to come up with a score of the degree of Afrocentrism that face contained. Okay, so you can do this for black and white faces. If we can identify Afrocentric and Eurocentric features and how they vary, then we can give each face a score on how Afrocentric it is or how Eurocentric it is, independent of skin color. Right? So Irene did this, and what she discovered was that for the same crime, the more Afrocentric the features, the harsher the penalty. And she found that to be true, I think, especially for white faces that had Afrocentric features. So why might this be happening? The judges aren't cognitively busy. It's because the judges, I think, are not even aware that something like the Afrocentrism of a face might affect their judgment. So having all the time in the world, having no competing tasks to do, and we might still fail at the task of being fair because we're unaware that something is even intervening in the decision.
Right. I mean, we find a similar result in a very recent resume study that Jack DeVideo and Shirley Tillman and others conducted, where they sent out resumes to scientists of reasonably but not over-the-top qualified people. And the resumes either had a female name or a male name on the top of the resume. And the likelihood of being called back for an interview, the initial salary that was offered, the degree of mentoring to which the person was going to be provided differed depending on whether the resume received had a male name or a female name at the top. And importantly, this was a between subjects design. That is, each person saw only one resume. But you're right, they had all the time in the world to do the evaluation of the resume. And so you were able to detect an effect that involved making use of a heuristic in a context that the person was not even aware of, and so didn't even have the possibility of correcting for. Whereas if as a judge, if as a resume evaluator, you said to yourself, okay, I'm going to read this resume, and I'm going to imagine that the name at the top is Bill Smith rather than Bonnie Smith, and see whether I have the same reaction. Or I'm going to imagine that this face looks different and see whether I have the same reaction. Once one has the information that there's the possibility of these implicit attitudes playing a role in the interpretation of, in some ways, ambiguous information, there's a chance of correcting for it. So I wonder whether you could talk about other sorts of techniques which are available to us once we're aware of the fact that A, our explicit and implicit attitudes may come apart, B, that even when we're not in a rush, our implicit attitudes may be playing a role in our interpretation of the world and our consequent response to it.
So I love the PNA study that you just mentioned that came from your colleagues at Yale, because it is the gold standard. You don't need the IAT.
Yeah.
You don't need to do a little test when the actual behavior in which you're interested, the hiring of the best candidate, is shown to be compromised. Yeah. This is why the symphony orchestra work was so interesting, because of the data that once a curtain began to be dropped during selection, the symphonies all across the country began to be much more gender integrated.
Right, so that's the famous work that Malcolm Gladwell popularized in Blink, that orchestras used to have a much lower percentage of women, and the minute you took away that gender information, the number of women selected for orchestras skyrocketed. Yeah.
That's right. It was much faster change than you would imagine happening in any other sphere, and so it has been attributed to the dropping of the curtain. So there are a few things that are of interest here. First of all, we all think we should get more information on each candidate we look at, not less. And what this is suggesting is that there are certain kinds of information that we should actually ask not to have, rather than have. The second thing that I would say is that these studies have been done now for a very long time. It's called the Goldberg paradigm, and Goldberg did some of the first research where he, in the 60s, submitted essays written by either a Joan or a John and found systematic differences and evaluation of them. So these studies there are hundreds of thousands of such studies. But what's interesting to me, and we might actually ask the question, all of a sudden in the world of biology, the Yale study is being discussed up and down. Everywhere I go, I'm asked about it. But to me, what's amazing is that each group refuses to be persuaded that they are capable of making these errors until a study is done with their population of people. And that itself to me is interesting, that somehow if I know that lawyers or judges or somebody does it, I can't believe that it could be me, that I have to be shown that it is my group that's doing this or I am doing this. And this is where I do think the benefit of the IAT can be seen, because it is something that you can experience directly. It is no longer saying some group of people, they live in New Hampshire, a different zip code of a different profession with different life experiences are showing it. We need to get people to come face to face with what is in their own mind in the same way as we want people, good people, to come face to face with what might be going on inside their bodies that they may not be aware of. This is just a simple fact. In medicine, we accept that I may not know what my hypertension level is, but that I can strap a little device to my wrist, and in a few seconds, it can spit out two numbers that could be life-saving. I think what we're now saying is that we do have rough approximations of what goes on in our minds, and using that information might be very, very powerful in changing behavior, because the good people we write about in the book do not intend ill. They do not want to make mistakes. They want those best women to be in symphony orchestras, in biology departments, and so on. So it's not a matter any longer. I mean, in the early 1970s, when Yale became a coeducational institution, George Pearson, a famous historian, said that women in his class should just know that he would never give a woman an A. Now, we don't have to deal with things like that, right? These are people who are happy and willing to let women succeed, if only they would. And so the question really for us is a much harder one, because it's not about conscious bias.
So I like the blood pressure analogy, and I want to press you on it in a couple of ways. One is to ask how constant, how stable across time IAT scores tend to be. So my blood pressure goes up and down with stress, but there's a sort of band within which it's typically found. It's also the case that whether my blood pressure is high or low depends upon a sort of constellation of factors. So I wonder whether you could answer two questions on that analogy. First, how stable are IAT scores for a given individual? And secondly, what diagnosis do you have for what it is that causes people to have or to lack these sorts of implicit associations?
So let's just take the first one. And actually, the blood pressure machine is not used randomly. Its reliability is about the same as that of an IAT. So you take your blood pressure at two different moments. If your elbow is on your desk or on your armchair, you will get slightly different readings. But the readings are a rough index across several days. Whatever is your average is going to be a pretty good indicator of whether you need to be on medication or not, whether you need to change your diet or not, whether you need to exercise more or not, and so on. I would say that the IAT is by no means perfectly reliable. It is roughly what a blood pressure machine does. I think it's about 0.6 or something like that. And that reliability, I would say, is all we have based on the methods we currently do to give us an indication. Enough of an indication that if we wished to do things differently, we might. So you asked the question of, if once we know this, then what? Very much like blood pressure, our attitudes are combinations of the way our minds evolved to interpret information, to seek information, to reason about it, to not reason about it, to misremember it, and so on. So there's a large evolutionary component. There is the big component of our culture. There is the perhaps even bigger component of our own individual path through that culture. And one of the results from the IAT that's been very interesting to us, and one that I never predicted we would find, is the variability of the result on the IAT as a function of what the immediate situation is. Mm-hmm. So if the IAT, in fact, we should be pleased in terms of social change. I think we should be pleased that while our minds will respond largely in some default way, based on the way in which our culture has tuned us up, individual experiences do matter. Their effects may not last very long, but theoretically it's quite interesting that girls who go to college and have many more women professors and take courses from women professors end up at the end of the 4 years showing a lower level of gender stereotypes. This is work done by Bhuju Dasgupta at UMass Amherst, and she was careful to say that it looked for a while like girls who went to single-sex colleges were ending up showing weaker gender stereotypes than girls who went to co-ed colleges. But her analysis shows that that's not correct, that it really has to do with the number of women professors you've taken courses from, and women who happen to go to single-sex schools just happen to take more courses from women professors. So this tells us that they are malleable, but of course, to what extent and for how long are really open questions for future research.
So what it sounds like you're saying fits with the more general picture of the human mind, according to which we're really good implicit encoders of correlation in the world. Many people think that this is how early language acquisition works, that one of the things that goes on is that we pick up on patterns. So that would suggest that exposing yourself to an environment in which counter-stereotypic associations are present and salient and frequent should play some role in, at least over the short term, dissipating some of the effects of the IAT. Do you see those sorts of effects where the exposure to something counter-stereotypical that's very salient can at least temporarily override these long encoded associations that are really just tracking correlations in the world?
That has been demonstrated. So there are now several studies that show that if you make people make the counter-stereotypic association opposite of the one that the culture typically pushes us towards, that you indeed can move them around enough that even on the IAT itself, you will see a more diminished expression of those stereotypes or those attitudes. I'll mention a particular study that I like a lot. It's a study that was run as a competition. So the Project Implicit group, Brian Nosek's group, and his student, Calvin, asked people to submit a 5-minute intervention of their choice that fit a certain number of criteria. And then they just ran these interventions to see if people's implicit race bias shifted as a function of it. And what I can tell you from this study is that certain interventions simply don't work. The intervention to think like an egalitarian person, to please try to think about this person in a good way or in a positive way, that doesn't do it. But it's what you said when you asked the question, does it work when you give them counter stereotypes? And it turns out that it does. So those manipulations, those interventions that actually relied on giving both sides of the counter examples the way in which we think, ended up producing some of the largest shifts. And I must have had an intuition about that a long time ago, because I built for myself a little screensaver, knowing that I spend much of my dismal life looking at a computer screen more than a human. I built a screensaver that just had in it counter-stereotypic images. So one of my favorite examples is a New Yorker cover of a woman who's a construction worker with her hard hat, but she's breastfeeding her baby. and I think of images like that as sort of pulling apart expectations that we typically carry around with us in so many different ways. But the hope is that seeing enough of them will make me be more open, let's say, to a young girl who walks into my office with a great idea about the future of my science that I may not have attended to, because in my old brain, the register in which she speaks, the manner in which she's dressed, may not have immediately brought to mind concepts like genius or brilliant. And the hope is that these counter stereotypes over time may have that impact.
So, I mean, in some sense, implicit attitudes are fundamentally conservative. What they do is they encode correlations that we've encountered in the world. And so even if our explicit attitudes are deliberately progressive, it's going to take our implicit attitudes some time to catch up on that. And that is directly parallel to what we find in the self-regulation literature. My habits of checking my email every 30 seconds, or of eating foods that I now recognize to be unhealthy, or sleeping late on days when I'm committed to get up early, are always just encodings of ways that I have been behaving up until now. And we all know from any kind of goal of self-change that simply telling yourself, I'm going to do something differently, is rarely sufficient to bring things into line with one another. So we use all sorts of what you might think of as horse whispering tricks to speak to the other parts of our soul, to go back to that Platonic metaphor. We let reason speak to the horses of spirit and appetite in the language that those horses understand. And I want to bring you back to a question that we lost the thread on earlier on. So one technique that you can use for dealing with these encoded associations is the presenting of counter-stereotypic information. One of them is the screening off of information that's going to be potentially distracting because one recognizes it as potentially distracting. Are there other tools that we can use, other categories of tools that we can use to allow our behavior to be guided by our reflective commitments rather than our non-reflective associations?
I think one very important tool is to select the kind of media we watch and listen to, because they are the channels through which much of this gets learned and unlearned. And I'll give you sort of a positive example. 10 years ago, the vast majority of Americans had fairly negative attitudes towards gay people. They said so openly on surveys about their discomfort working with them, even in the workplace, let alone having close friends. In this very short period of time, about 10 years or so, this attitude has changed dramatically. How did it change? Not because each one of us decided that we were going to become more positive in our attitudes towards gay people, but because a group of people intervened in our lives without telling us that they were, without announcing anything, and that was Hollywood. Hollywood portrayed people who were gay as ordinary, as our friends, our family, nice people, cool people, and they've produced enough of a change, in my opinion, that we now see Iowa saying yes to gay marriage. Now, that's something that I think is worth taking note of. What institutions can do, what organizations can do, to put certain associations forward that have simply not been, and the power of those sweeping through the culture may be much larger than what any individual mind sitting at his or her desk can actually do. So I just want to put that out there for those people, including you guys, and using blogging heads to get your ideas out. And then, of course, the question for every person, especially a young person, is, now that the world is at your feet, now that you can listen to Mongolian children making rap music, what will you choose to listen to? You know what, now it's not the 3 TV stations anymore and the 1 newspaper at your doorstep. And so I think this is a very exciting moment, and it tells me that I can now create, to a much greater extent than I could have before, what my mind receives.
Of course, the view that non-rational persuasion is an effective means of social change is hardly news to the early 20th century. There's a way in which the old Soviet posters giving us the happy proletariat, or the posters produced by the German or Italian fascist regimes, which gave us the associations between the happy Volk and the society structured in the way that those societies were, are exactly like the TV shows showing us the sorts of social change that you described previously. Do you have thoughts? I mean, in some sense, the power of non-rational persuasion is extraordinary. It's a central theme of Plato's Republic, how dangerous it is, and it's certainly a central theme throughout the 2,500 years of Western history since then, that what might charitably or uncharitably be called propaganda is among the most effective ways of changing minds. So do you have anything to say about the ways in which the TV shows that showed us a black chief executive or a happy gay couple are or are not like, to take the less tendentious case, 1930s Soviet propaganda?
Yeah, so, as a Frankfurt School philosopher said, it's not the Gestapo at the door that I worry about, it's the TV in my bedroom.
That's right.
And I actually think that the place where I believe that there is reason for hope is the diversity of the sources of media. So I can listen to Fox News or to Al Jazeera. That didn't used to be possible. And this is true in many. Now, it may well be that when I look at the 24 hours in my day, there's only this much. But it certainly tells me that, and I actually think that, just looking at tweets. So I was really impressed in the bombing of this hotel in Mumbai when it happened, just how rapidly we learned of what was going on inside this hotel in real time before any media could get there, through just what those tweets were. So we're going to have to be a lot smarter at what is rational and non-rational information. We're going to have to do a lot more work to make sure that the sources from which we receive it are the sources that can be trusted. But I don't see any real difference, in the use of propaganda by any group anywhere. There's propaganda that I like and propaganda I don't like, but it is all propaganda.
Right.
All I can do as an individual person is to we would hope that in our society we would, through education, create a way in which people can separate out the irrational forms of information from the more rational forms.
But one of the things that's complicated about the information in the case of the IAT that you're talking about, these sort of correlations, is that we do live in a society structured by racial categories, by gender categories, by class categories. And it is, in some sense, ignoring factual information not to let myself learn that right now, given my society structures. There's a sort of correlation between this racial group, this gender group, this social class, and these sorts of activities. So do you have any thoughts about how one can sort of titrate one's availability of that information so that when it's salient, I have it online, and when it isn't, I somehow manage to keep it in the background?
Yeah, there is a concept called statistical discrimination. Then here's the idea that you're not really being biased. All you're doing is paying attention to the covariation of two things in the real world, and your brain accurately learns that, and then it spits it out. So why? Why should you even call that a bias? So it's a reasonable question. And we went about studying it by actually looking at how accurate we are in the base rates that we have. Turns out we are pretty pathetic. So if you ask people just how many people of X group vote or have committed a crime or choose to have 3 children or whatever it might be, most of us are just terrible at knowing the accurate actual base rates of these. So what we have is a smattering of information. We have something that allowed our ancestors to survive in a world where looking at somebody different was enough of an ordeal that assuming the worst of them was just fine, and using that information that there was a marker of difference to turn away and run or to kill them. That made sense. But the modern mind has to now deal with difference in a slightly different way. When we look at people who are genetically quite different from us, when we look at people who are socioculturally alien to us, we have to look at them and say, will that person make a great scientist? will that person be somebody I should outsource to and make money off of in my business? So I'm going to say, look, diversity is an acquired taste. Diversity is not what the natural mind gravitates towards. It is just something that we acquire through the dint of conscious values and intentions that are coming from a place very different than where these associations are built. And we have every indication that in our past we've changed, that we've gone off to foreign countries and made sense of people who are very different from us. Just think about the question of gender, which you brought up, where in the big scheme of things, only a little while ago women could not vote, and in these last few weeks we've been discussing women being in combat. So these change, but they don't change because the world necessarily is changing and our minds simply reflect them. We go beyond that and we say, but this is how we hope to be. And we make laws and we make choices that reflect that hope, not just the actual correlations that we see out there.
Do you see generational shifts in the IATs?
We do and we don't, and I'll tell you why I think it's so interesting. So take the gender stereotype test, on which we find that 75% of men and 80% of women show the stereotype. So they associate career with male and home with female and have an easier time doing that than the reverse. On that test, there is a very clear effect of the age of the person taking the test. So 10-year-olds show the least bias, and 20-year-olds a little stronger, and 30-year-olds are stronger than them, and so on all the way up into people in their 60s. Suggesting to us, although not conclusively, but suggesting to us that indeed, as you said, as the world is changing, as there are more women in the workplace and more dads who might choose to stay home, that both of those together are shifting these for folks who are younger and younger than us. That's that. Now, if that were true, then on every IAT, we should more or less see this kind of shift, and we don't. Mm-hmm. So let's take the race attitude test. This is the association of good and bad with black and white. And it turns out that whether you're 6 years old or whether you're 70 years old, the magnitude of the bias is identical. In other words, our conscious attitudes towards race have changed massively. But the IAT is not reflecting that change. And that's just a fact. We have to now come to terms with it and not be terrified of it, as some people are. And say, all right, if we're changing on that gender stereotype but not on race, what might account for that? And I would offer that it has to do with our segregation. The fact that we might see black people on TV, we might even have somebody at work, but how often do we eat a meal together? How often are we neighbors? How often do we sit next to each other on a school bench? And I think that's until those behaviors change, it's likely that the race IAT will not change.
But the race IAT, if I understand the data correctly, shows to some extent an anti-black bias even among people of African descent in contemporary American society.
So the numbers are that 70% of white Americans show white preference, and of the 30% remaining, about half show no effect one way or another. They're neutral, and then a small percentage of whites actually show pro-black effects. And then amongst African Americans, the data are that 40% of African Americans show black preference, as opposed to the 70% of whites who do. 40% of black Americans actually associate white with good, and 20% show no difference. Mm-hmm. So your question is a very good one, because if it just has to do with who you eat lunch with and who you sit next to and all of that, then that doesn't explain why 40% of African Americans themselves show negativity. So this is, we've written about this in several papers, that we do, in a sense, our minds contain the thumbprint of the culture. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that they do, Black Americans have come to learn that their group is not good. we have data now that are in press that will appear shortly in Psychological Science, showing that we can go down as young as 3 years of age. We can't use the IAT with 3-year-olds. We can use other kinds of measures of automatic preference. And when we do that, we find that Black kids, as just like Black adults, even at age 3, are not showing in-group preference to the same extent as East Asian kids are or white kids are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the sources, as with any interesting psychological phenomenon, are multiple, and that the effects, as with any interesting psychological phenomenon, are multiple, but that nonetheless there's a kind of approximate characterization that can be given that's really illuminating, namely that it's possible for us to have completely egalitarian explicit attitudes and nonetheless to have implicit attitudes that come apart from those in quite radical ways, and that although some of our behavior is guided by our explicit commitments and our reflective desires, lots and lots of our reactions and actions end up being guided by these implicit associations, and that, like blood pressure, learning about it is one of the first steps we can take towards compensating for it to the extent that we can, and to the extent that we want our behavior to be guided by our reflective commitments. I wonder whether there's anything you want to add, since we're coming up near an hour, in closing about the themes of the book. There are many, many other ideas that come up in the context of the book that we didn't have time to touch on, and I wondered whether you want to present one of those as our closing teaser.
I would choose an idea that I think is going to be a difficult one for us to deal with. It's new for me to be contemplating it. We write about it in the book in a section called Carla's Hand. Mm-hmm. And Carla's Hand is a description of an event that occurred to a friend of mine, Carla Kaplan, in which treatment in a hospital towards her changed dramatically from perfectly reasonable to exceptional when they discovered that she was a Yale professor. They didn't know that when they first began stitching up her hand. They thought she was a quilter, and then discovered that she was a Yale professor. I take that event, and Tony Greenwald takes that event as indicative of something we might want to consider. And that is that in modern minds like ours, discrimination does not unfold by harming the outgroup, but rather that discrimination has its effects by helping the in-group. This is a difficult question to even untangle, because helping is a very positive thing. Helping our friends and our family and the people nearby us is not only automatic, it's something that we would want to only support. And yet this question that I think people from your profession, philosophers, have been raising for us, people like Peter Singer and others, like, about who we help and how we help. I think those questions are going to come to the forefront. And my hope is that techniques like the IAT will simply give us an indication, a little needle on a compass, as to where we're actually heading, so that our behavior can be different from it, sometimes even the opposite of it.
Good. Well, thank you so much. And that discussion of helping behavior and helping in groups and the ways in which very, very small changes and differences can accumulate to lead to very large ones is another one of the major themes of the book. And I hope that at least some of our listeners are intrigued enough by the things you've said in our conversation to follow up on these ideas, perhaps by reading the book, perhaps by taking the IAT. So I just want, on behalf of the Mind Report, to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about this.
Thank you, Tamar. It was a real pleasure.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.